I kind of think of postmodernism as a bit like that. I mean, there's this attempt to sort of understand all narratives and understand that they're all completely corrupt or spent or we're somehow beyond them. And that is simultaneously, I think, the ego saying, I'm in control now. And at the same time, it's a type of thinking that undermines itself.
Welcome to the Reality Therapy Podcast, where the truth will set you free.
Welcome. My guest today is Dr. Bret Alderman, who is a depth psychologist and author of Eternal Youth and the Myth of Deconstruction. I think we're going to have a great conversation, so welcome.
Good to talk with you, Ryan. I've been looking forward to this.
So tell me a little bit about who you are and your background.
Okay. Well, I was born in the Pacific Northwest in Seattle, Washington, where I was raised mostly in that area. And when I got a little older, I went to the Evergreen State College, which has become a little bit infamous for some political scandals that happened there. Brett Weinstein and Heather Heying were professors at that college, and they got kicked out for essentially political reasons. And so I happen to also, have graduated from that same school, which is we could get into or not. And then after I graduated, I actually moved to Mexico and lived in Mexico and Latin America for about 15 years. And towards the tail end of that stint, I started doing my doctorate in psychology at the Pacifica Graduate Institute. That was in 12, I believe I graduated. It's either that or 2013.
Did you have like a specialization?
Well, that's a good question. I was in a program that gave you a non-clinical degree in psychology. So I really didn't learn a lot of the techniques and skills that a clinician would. I was really studying more the history of depth psychology, which would be the history of the psychology of the unconscious, the legacy of Freud and Jung and everyone who came after that, which is a lot of different people. And so, it was a unique program, and I was because it wasn't a clinical degree, I didn't really have to learn a lot of the diagnoses and the APA, categorization of psychological symptoms. And it's kind of a unique degree in psychology. So
So
kind of a
most of the
strange
people
niche.
that I have on here are therapists, and I've had a couple psychiatrists, but I feel like depth psychology is in its own little animal,
Mm,
And so I feel like it doesn't seem accessible to a lot of people. You've got
mm,
Freud who's writing all this weird stuff about sex, and then
mm,
Jung is interpreting dreams, and then everybody else seems to write in incomprehensible prose.
mm.
Like it's hard to even begin, depth psychology. So how would you even start to frame what you do in this discipline?
Just before I do that, I want to say that my experience is almost the opposite. Because for me, depth psychology, that is psychology. When I look at the other stuff, and I'm like, are you kidding me? You're calling that psychology? What are you guys talking about?
Interesting. Okay.
Where is the psyche in your psychology? It's kind of, yeah. So depth psychology. So any form of psychology that believes that there is something called the unconscious psyche. Any form of psychology that says, there's my conscious self, but there's this vast landscape of thoughts and feelings and sensations that are also a part of me, but they're not a part of my conscious ego, my consciousness. So, the meme or image that's often used to talk about this is the iceberg, and you can see that only a tiny fraction of the iceberg is above the level of the water that it's floating in, right? And the rest is all beneath the water. And that's kind of a good metaphor to think about how depth psychologists view the human beings. It's like there's that little part of us that's conscious, and then there's all this other stuff that we're not aware of or only dimly aware of. And so even though I think depth psychology obviously is not the predominant form of psychology anymore, not even remotely close, which was a shock to me, I think in a lot of ways everybody has become a depth psychologist, not necessarily a good one, but But, if you're talking about when you hear people say, talk about repression or symbolism or introvert and extrovert, I mean, these are all terms that come straight from depth psychology. If we talk about someone who's got a complex, like, well, that's the term that Jung came up with for a set of, ideas and images that are also emotionally charged and often have kind of an archetype core to them. I mean, so there's all these depth psychological notions that people have already accepted, which makes it hard to realize that in some sense, as a colleague of mine has said elsewhere, we're all Freudians now. There's some truth to that. It's unfortunate because people don't really read Freud, so they don't do a good Freud, but
Yeah, I feel like a big part of the criticism of depth psychology, Freud and Jung, is that it's kind of a lot of it's unfalsifiable. You can't really test the unconscious because you can't really see it directly. But
yeah.
when you explain it to people, like you explain it like you're explaining, a lot of these ideas are just basically common sense to us now. They've been absorbed in our society because they resonate with so many people.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, well said. Well said. That makes really perfect sense to me, just because I know that especially Jung was really trying to translate into a more modern idiom a lot of the common sense and the common mythology and common religions of our forebears. He was just kind of trying to translate a lot of that, you know, religious language and the language of myth, translated into a more modern and accessible form. I mean, he was growing up in an age of secularization where, people just couldn't take religion seriously in the same way that they had in the past. There was just too much of the rise of science and Enlightenment thinking kind of was a huge critique of a lot of religious thinking. And in a lot of ways, Jung was trying to translate between those two ways of thinking about the world.
I feel like this is a rabbit trail, but I'm going to go down it anyway. How do you feel like the modern world, when you talk about like archetypes and mythology, I'm thinking of like the Iliad and the Odyssey would have been, common stories told to each other for 1,000 years in ancient Greece.
Yeah,
And now we have a different Marvel movie every year. We're kind
yeah,
of bouncing from archetype and myth, one to another. You could watch 5 different movies in one day on Netflix. We don't kind of cling to a common mythology as a
yeah.
society. How is that affecting our psyches?
God, yeah, that's a rabbit hole. Throw a nice softball at me.
Yeah, yeah.
I think it's contributing to just a disintegration of values, a disintegration of the culture. We need cultural norms and kind of commonly accepted reference points and stories just to be able to understand one another. And we don't have that. And it's a shame. It's a shame. I want to say more, but I also want you to ask me the question again so I can get my head around it a little better.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, when you read like a lot of the Greek people around the time of Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, a lot of their contemporaries, they're constantly referencing Achilles. Achilles is just the greatest Greek of all time, just the ultimate alpha male, basically. And
Yeah.
now we have like a different archetype or a different kind of hero figure who like looks different. It's a different person with different values. Again, in whatever the new novel is or the new movie or the new television show, and you're picking up on different things. And I feel like it's hard for us to like, it feels like, and again, I could be completely misrepresenting history, but it feels like for all their flaws, the Greeks were really rooted in their kind of mythological history in a way that we've kind of lost in a sense. Cause there's just so much, there's no way you can kind of root your psyche into it.
Yeah, yeah. And rootlessness was a theme that Jung kept coming back to
Mm.
because he understood that with the loss of, traditional religion, there was nevertheless still a need for those same types of stories and a need for those same ideas and archetypes to express themselves. What was the vessel for that? One of Jung's reflections that I think is really pertinent to our historical moment is that when religious ideas aren't fully acknowledged, they just come out in in the form of ideology. I mean, that's fundamental to his critique of both far right and far left thinking, both Nazism and Marxism, when he lived through both.
Mm.
And he saw religious themes happening in both of those ideologies. The swastika, infamously, is really a mystical symbol from Tibet. It's a religious symbol that was appropriated. Um, there's a lot of utopic thinking in Nazism that kind of mimics the idea of a heaven on earth, or, an eventual heaven that people can reach. That's sort of a mythic theme there. There's a theme of death and rebirth. Hitler was supposed to kind of bring the rebirth. The idea of a Third Reich is a rebirth. That's a rebirth motif. These are all mythological and psychological ideas. And so Jung was living in that time and reflecting how a lot of what we're seeing in the political sphere, in the ideological realm, it's kind of like an unconscious reflection of a lot of these essentially religious motifs.
That's very interesting. This may be a difficult question given that we're in the middle of it, but like when you look at contemporary America, what does the Donald Trump archetype represent?
Yeah, gosh, that's a hard
Not
one.
to be too controversial.
Well, but I might as well. So I've had my own thinking on Trump has really evolved a lot. I did not vote for him the first two times he ran, and I had a very mild case of Trump derangement syndrome. It wasn't full blown, but I didn't like the guy. I was relieved when he was not in office anymore. But I'm wondering now if he isn't exactly the sort of strong father figure that we need. Obviously, he's a flawed person. I think an armchair diagnosis of narcissism is called for. I mean, we can do that. But he's a lot more than that. And it's weird because if you look at his opposition, if you look at the political left right now, a lot of the criticism is basically a critique of tradition, authority, male authority, masculinity itself, father figures. It's like all of it is, all of the criticism from the left is directed at that type of figure. And here he is, this, overly confident, big voiced man who's made a huge success and has been the ultimate alpha male. I mean, it's just going to trigger every possible, emotional wound of somebody who sees the entire world through this sort of mythology, really, that strong male leader bad.
Yeah.
Strong male leader patriarchy. This actually kind of comes up in my book in a different way, but it's that critique of what in Jungian psychology would be called a senex, the old man figure, the old patriarch, which in mythology might show up as Yahweh or Jehovah or Zeus or Daedalus. I mean, just any like strong male older figure who has some degree of authority. So
That's really interesting.
I'm hopeful for Trump, and I don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really fast. I had probably a strong case of Trump derangement syndrome in 2016. I think it led me to try to understand where people were coming from, because I just assumed that a majority of the country I lived in were full of Nazis, and so I think it motivated me to try to understand other people, which I think I do a better job of now. So yeah. It's kind of interesting with Trump because that archetype fits so many. It's so many different people. It's the father who told you to be on time when you're coming home. It's the boss who told you have to stay late. That type of archetype of somebody telling me what to do. I'm picturing, I don't know if you know, Twisted Sister, We're Not Gonna Take It. Like the man that you're sticking it to looks like Donald Trump in my mind.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So we have a natural lead in to your book, and bristled a little bit the first time I read the title, because in the subtitle we've got Jacques Derrida and Judith Butler, who are two people it's not a fun read for me.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Just tell me a little bit about your book.
I tell people sometimes I read them so you don't have to.
I love that.
Yeah. So the book started as well, it actually started as a chapter in my doctoral dissertation that was going to be a part of my first book, but it never got in there. So I was kind of writing on this I was writing on Jacques Derrida, and I wanted to find well, maybe I should backtrack a little bit. I've had an issue with a lot of thinkers that we would call postmodern. This dates back to when I was like 20 years old going to Evergreen State College. And so I've wrestled with a lot of different thinkers like Michel Foucault, who's kind of the granddaddy of queer theory, Jacques Derrida, the founder of deconstruction, Richard Rorty, who's an American neo-pragmatist who's really a kind of a postmodernist in his own way. So I've been kind of looking at those types of thinkers for a long time. And because my degree's in psychology, and I'm really steeped in Jungian psychology, what I've tried to do is look at these types of thinkers, but not so much criticize them from a philosophical point of view as much as analyze them from a psychological point of view. So I'm really looking at people like Jacques Derrida and saying, what are the psychological dynamics that I can glean in his writings? What are some of the complexes that I see being worked out in his writings? And lastly, if he's stuck in a myth or a mythology, what is it? And so I started this book out as it was going to be a chapter in which I was comparing Jacques Derrida to an archetype that in Jungian thinking is called the puer aeternus, which means eternal youth. Quintessential eternal youth figure that everyone will probably know is Peter Pan. Peter Pan stays 8 or 9 forever, right? He's eternally young. So eternal youth figures either remain eternally young or they die young. And so they remain young in our memory. Like an example of that would be Icarus, who flies too close to the sun, his wings melt, he falls to the ground and dies. So he dies at a young age. And that figure is sort of used by Jungians to talk about not only certain mythological figures, but it's also, we talk about the eternal youth as a way of talking about particular people who have an attitude of eternal youth. They're sort of, they're people with a Peter Pan complex. Well into their 50s or 60s, they're acting like they're still 19 and have an infinite amount of future ahead of them, when in fact, they might be a lot closer to passing than they want to recognize. That was a mouthful, but I'm comparing eternal youth to Jacques Derrida and trying to analyze Jacques Derrida in terms of psychological motifs and mythological ideas.
So I have like a harebrained theory around this, and I want to ask you like how it shapes up in your conceptualization. So the pre-modern world was generally dictated by religion. And so in like Freudian terms, you had the id with our baser instincts being negotiated by the superego, the patriarchs of the society, basically. Yeah. And then we come into modernity and we have like Enlightenment rationalism. And in a lot of ways, Enlightenment rationalism ignores the id and the superego in favor of the ego. So it's like pure rationality, like this logic of efficiency. Yeah. God is dead. We're kind of ignoring that, but also we're going to try to suppress our baser instincts, just live in the ego. And postmodernism to me seems to ignore the superego. There's no God, there's no hierarchy, but it also ignores the ego because there's no rationality that we recognize, and it's this pure, cauldron of instinctual desires. It's just pure id in a lot of ways. I'm wondering if you see that.
I can see that reading. It makes sense to me. It's strange. I think a lot of postmodernism, it kind of feels like it's the ego and consciousness kind of reaching an apex of like almost a hubristic certainty before it completely fails. I mean, the image that I use for a lot of postmodernism in my first book is the image of Prometheus. Prometheus, he steals fire from the gods. Now, symbolically, that means something like us humans are not going to be subjected to any will other than our own. The gods, they don't have authority over us anymore. We're going to become godlike. That's what is at the heart of the Promethean myth, is like we're going to assume a certain godlikeness and we're going to raise ourselves above the level of mere beasts. Prometheus brings fire, which brings culture, which brings knowledge, which brings the empowerment of human beings, right? And so it has this, it's sort of in many ways it's kind of an anti-religious myth in a way, stealing fire from the gods to empower human beings. And that's what Prometheus does but he also has to suffer his own defeat at the hands of Zeus. I mean, he gets punished. He gets tied to a mountain, and an eagle comes and eats his liver out every day. The liver for the Greeks was like the seat of the soul, so there's a lot of symbolism there. So he has to suffer this huge torment for a long time. I kind of think of postmodernism as a bit like that. I mean, there's this attempt to sort of understand all narratives and understand that they're all completely corrupt or spent, or we're somehow beyond them. And that is simultaneously, I think, the ego saying, I'm in control now. And at the same time, it's a type of thinking that undermines itself. It reminds me of what Jung would call an enantiodromia. It's when something turns into its opposite. So, for example, the sun rises, and right at its very peak at noon, roughly, it starts to descend. I kind of feel like the postmodern, especially perhaps the first generation postmodernists, they're right at that apex where they think we've got something now, and then it all starts to fall apart. Deconstruction falls apart by virtue of its own internal contradictions. The deconstructors start to deconstruct themselves,
Yeah.
right? I don't know.
Yeah.
I like your reading too, and I like the fact that we can also read this a bit differently. That to me, we're just working on a complex. We're working on a cultural complex. We're looking at this from multiple angles and trying to figure out how do we get here?
Yeah, the deconstruction phenomenon is so bizarre because it almost implies that there's nothing left to build in society. Like our real accomplishment now is to tear down.
Yeah.
At the end of deconstruction, the only thing left to do is more deconstruction.
Yeah.
There doesn't seem to be any point where it's like, okay, we've deconstructed Western civilization enough. Now let's start contributing something. That doesn't seem to be part of the equation.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Which, to me makes perfect sense if I'm thinking of the psychology of the eternal youth, puer dynamics. Eternal youth figures, they want to, if you look at what they're in antagonism to, eternal youth figures, they hate authority, law, limits, history, order, structure. They're all those same things that you can really see being attacked in both first generation postmodernism, like Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault. But you can also see those are the same types of things that are being pushed against and attacked in things like queer theory. I mean, queer theory is a perfect example of like trying to completely dismantle the most primary assumptions and all sense of norms, and all of it is really, from a mythological point of view, it seems to me like it's an attack on father in a lot of ways. It's an attack on the patriarch. It's an attack on tradition.
Do you see an evolution in postmodernism? Because like the first generations, Foucault and all these people in France, there seemed to be like, not that they weren't serious, but there was a bit of like playful irony to them, especially
Yeah.
someone like Baudrillard. It's like I enjoy reading Baudrillard as long as you don't take him too seriously.
Yeah.
But it seems like the more recent postmodernists, it's like we're not trying to just like everything is nonsense while we smoke our cigarette. It's like we're actually trying to seize power, and it's not
Yeah.
just like kind of a dispassionate commentary on society. We're actually trying to like become the father figure, you might say.
Yeah. 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 I see a similar dynamic. It's kind of applied postmodernism, I think, is a bit what you're referring to. Derrida, in particular, was critiqued for having a stance that was kind of ambivalent toward politically. I mean, kind of like he was criticized for analyzing texts, but even his fans would say, "But okay, well, what are the political consequences of this? Well, how can it be applied? I mean, you're seeing these, you're talking about texts, which is great, but how is that going to help us in any way?" And so he started to kind of branch off into things like legal theory with some frightening results. It's interesting. One of the people who wrote the introduction to one of his works, whose name I'm forgetting at the moment, she came up with a term called strategic essentialism.
I've heard that.
Yeah, so the first generation postmodernists were what was called like anti-essentialist. They're kind of just taking apart the idea that there's any essential nature, there's any essential type, there's no inherent anything, no inherent order. It's all of it is just sort of constructed by human beings, right? They're anti-foundationalist. So one of their favorite people to attack is Plato, because Plato's the one
Mm.
who's noted for these primordial forms that sort of exist in an eternal realm. Just they're there. And first generation postmodernists just tear Plato and Platonic thinking apart. Jung is very rooted in a lot of Platonic ideas, archetype being
Mm.
one of the primary ones.
I
But
want to interject real quick.
yeah,
I think part of the reason the postmodernists hate Plato is because this Socratic ideal of assuming you don't know things is intellectual humility, which they don't
yeah,
like.
yeah, yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, but I think you're spot on there. So the first generation postmodernists had that kind of anti-essentialist bent, but then, um, they started to kind of change their tune a bit and start to talk about strategic essentialism. Like we can talk about essentialism if it's politically convenient for our cause. It's really interesting now in kind of more current postmodern thinking. If we look at someone like Judith Butler and gender theory and queer theory, and there's a lot of essentialist thinking. In fact, the idea that there's this sort of like internal self that a person can perceive with such clarity that they can say, well, yeah, I'm actually a woman. You might look at the gray beard and whatnot, but no, there's this essential nature I have that sort of trumps what you can see with your own eyes. That's a really essentialist form of thinking. That's like there's an essential self, it's a gendered self. I can know it, you can't. But it but it's not a conscious form of essentialism. It's kind of like an unconscious one that's coming out in this strange way. I don't know. I hope
That
I'm making sense.
No,
And
that's
I'm kind
so
of
fascinating. I keep getting back to like how postmodernism has evolved because you had Foucault who said we can fight the system with folly. And then,
yeah,
Judith Butler who talked about queering discourses, it leads to like drag queen story hour. And like the idea is you kind of make a mockery out of all this
yeah,
essentially,
yeah,
because none of it matters. None of it's even real anyway.
yeah,
And then it kind of evolves to this point where it's like, I would be willing to die for to defend this essential category of trans identity, for instance.
yeah, yeah. It's it's a strange evolution. Jacques Derrida had his form of play. He called it, linguistic play. Foucault with his folly, and a lot of those writers were, yeah, they were playful. You could sense their sense of humor. I, things got darker and darker. I don't know, but I kind of feel like something really shifted in the collective psyche around 2015 or so, when a lot of these ways of thinking that I could kind of, begrudgingly accept and appreciate parts of them just got put on steroids and became absolutely insane and serious, to use your word.
Yeah. I'm wondering, I think you have a unique perspective as a depth psychologist, but when I look at kind of society, it's like there was some big shift. You saw a huge shift in 2020, but maybe 2014 there was another shift in
Mm.
like the collective consciousness, psyche, collective unconscious, if you want to use that Jungian term. And some of the things you see is like, one is just in the entire field of psychology, all of a sudden people were just almost unanimously saying the appropriate treatment for many mentally ill kids is chemical and surgical castration.
Yeah.
And no one seemed to like have a different opinion.
Yeah.
In 2020, it was like this is the deadliest pandemic in generations, and you have to, stay inside, mask up, and social distance unless you're attending a Black Lives Matter rally, in which case racism is the real pandemic, and just something about the collective psyche, just everybody just kind of went along with this, and just there was a complete lack of questioning, it felt like.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I saw it too. Many of us have those shifts, and I think historians will be writing about it for many years to come. I think about my own, how I have identified politically. And for a long time, I was comfortable saying I was on the left. I was always sort of skeptical of certain things on the left, but I was fine saying that. And that's not the case now. I mean, it's like there's just been a fundamental shift. I like thinking of the left in terms of liberalism and illiberalism.
I
And
like
the
that.
left that I grew up with, even at, far left Evergreen State College, was a leftism of liberalism. You let people speak.
Mm,
You try to really listen to the other. It's really live and let live. It had a little libertarian element to the liberalism,
mm,
right? It was kind of more based in like a John Stuart Mill,
mm.
like a classical liberalism. And now, I mean, free speech is, I mean, who can honestly say that it's the left that's championing free speech right now when we've got the evidence of the Twitter files, that there's just been a real change on the left. It no longer is what it used to be. So when I think of those big shifts that you're talking about in 2015 or 2020, it's a shift from being liberal in a classic sense to being illiberal and authoritarian.
How do you in terms of like a Jungian archetype, how do you conceptualize this live and let live liberalism of East thousands?
Yeah,
I'm not going to come in your bedroom. If you want to smoke pot in your house, good for
yeah,
you. It's just
yeah,
like you do
yeah,
you, I do me, like this kind of live and let live mentality that somehow shifted into like this almost Maoist type of authoritarian mentality. How you,
yeah.
what like kind of archetype just, explains that?
I think the eternal youth archetype does
Mm,
explain that. A wonderful novel that I read when I was very young, and I'm so grateful for it, is a novel by Milan Kundera. And the novel is called Life is Elsewhere. Milan Kundera was a Czech-born novelist who was a member of the Communist Party and later became thoroughly disillusioned with the party and wrote a series of novels that are critical of revolutionary psychology, revolutionary mentality, and he associated it with the spirit of youth. There's a kind of the desire to be, how can I say this? The desire for revolution tends to be something that young people, there are more young
mm,
revolutionaries than older
mm,
revolutionaries, you know? A lot of people can be kind of super Marxist when they're 20 and then they get to like 30 and have to pay the bills and they have kids and they kind of look at, oh, this Marxism stuff doesn't quite work, does it? So they have, it's like the famous Churchill quote that, if you're young and not a liberal,
mm,
where's your heart? And if you're older and not conservative, it's like, where's your mind or
mm,
something. I'm butchering it, but it's that attitude. It's almost as like the left that had that wonderful creative eternal youth puer attitude of creativity and just let people do what they want to do. And, we don't need all these rules and boundaries and people getting in our bedrooms and stuff. It kind of turned into its polar opposite. There's an undercurrent of authoritarian attitude
mm,
that comes out in that. It's kind of like the natural compensation. The more anti-authoritarian the person's conscious point of view is, the more you're going to see this shadow side of an authoritarian underbelly. That makes
well, that
perfect sense to me. Oh,
can
hell
you
yeah.
can you flesh that out for me? That's interesting.
Well, I mean, let's look at, I don't know, what's happening in the realm of gender right now. Like, there's the story is that there's this thing called cis heteronormativity, you know, the idea that the norm is to be heterosexual and to have a gender identity that's congruent with your physical body, your sexed body. Like there's the idea that's like some evil that has to be vanquished so that we can truly liberate ourselves and just be who we want to be, just be our true selves, That aspect of the theory is sort of like, it sounds like it's anti-authoritarian because the authority that's being vanquished is the heteronormativity. That's the authority that we're attacking. But in the process of doing it, we set up a different form of authority, the one that says that you have to speak to me in the terms that I say are appropriate for you. You know, what your speech coming out of your mouth involves my pronouns. It becomes very authoritarian in the way people speak, the way people have to conceive of sex and gender, the way people have to think politically. A thoroughly anti-patriarchal stance just ends up setting up different forms authoritarianism, different forms of thought that are acceptable and not acceptable. I mean, that's how I see it. And if
That's
none of that explanation feels coherent or feels off, I mean, feel free
no,
to
that's so
let me know.
fascinating, and it's like this idea of you start with an idea of I want to defend someone who's marginalized, somehow struggling, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay, well, the first thing I'm going to do is not attack them. It's like, well, through some indirect means, they might be being attacked by prevented from accessing hormones or something like that. Okay, now I have to jump in and be the protector role, and part of that protector involves seizing power so that I can protect someone. It's like in my mind, this is like a defensive maneuver, me seizing power.
Yeah. Yeah. In your mind, but in for the other people around you, when you're seizing power, doesn't look like you're a liberator. It looks like you're yet another authority. I mean, it's fascinating. If you look at the history of a lot of different revolutions, they seem to start off as, with this sort of idealistic um, movement that wants to topple authority, and then almost immediately once they get in power, I mean, look what happens. I mean, study Stalinism,
Yeah.
Maoism, study any communist revolution. They always start off with what sound like beautiful ideas. They topple one authority and they reinstitute another authority that ends up being probably more despotic than the one that was replaced, arguably.
That's kind of the bizarre thing about America is as being founded, the founders like, how can we give ourselves the least amount of authority?
Yeah, yeah. It's
Yeah, I wanted to talk about this, like the eternal youth drive for eternal youth. I feel like with the transgender thing, with autogynephilia, you've got a lot of middle-aged men who want to transition and on the other side come out as young, beautiful, sexually desirable women.
yeah,
And I haven't thought about that till just now talking to you, but like that seems to fit with this like drive for eternal youth.
yeah. Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And part of that archetype of eternal youth is also the belief that I can be who I want to be. I create myself. I'm not subject to limits. I'm not subject to the limitations of the fact that I was born a man.
Mm.
Nothing I can do about it. No, 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 says the eternal youth. You can be who you want to be. And to pretend something is to be that something. This really comes out clearly in Judith Butler. I know I'm getting a little bit off
No,
autogynephilia,
yeah,
but
it's good.
Judith Butler's, I mean, if you take away all of the intellectual and pseudo-intellectual jargon and garb that she litters her work with, and you just boil her thesis down to its most essential is uh, what is pre- what is what you pretend is what's real, and you
Mm.
create yourself through pretending. Now she uses the word performance, For her, you sort of create the gendered self through performing it. Peter Pan says the same thing. He says, we're going to pretend something and it becomes real in Neverland. There's this wonderful scene in Neverland or in Peter Pan where Peter Pan is eating imaginary food. He's pretending to eat, but he literally grows fat. Now, what is literal and what is pretend in some imaginary realm like that? Who knows? But it's that strange conflation of pretending and thinking that it's real. That's really it's a central part of the eternal youth myth. And it's right there in Judith Butler's idea of gender performativity. If I just pretend to be someone, I am that someone. And curiously enough, Peter Pan gets furious if people don't pretend the way he wants them to pretend. And you can see this a lot in unfortunately, in, people who have been caught up in trans ideology and, if you don't accept the pronouns, if you don't accept the pretense of someone being something that you can see that they're not, depending on who you're talking with, you could be face to face with someone who's absolutely infuriated.
Mm.
That's right there in the Peter Pan story.
There's so many different directions to go with this eternal youth Peter Pan metaphor. I'm thinking like little kids will have pretend tea parties and they take a sip of something and it's not really there, but you're pretending. My
Yeah.
brother and I, when we were kids, would fight against invisible monsters, But when you're an adult, you can't pretend to pay bills.
Ah,
You have to actually give them money, And I think what Butler is saying is no, pretend is reality, and there's no reason it shouldn't be. It's like this. I don't want to grow up. I still want to have tea parties, basically.
yeah. Yeah, there's a wonderful motif that I talked about quite a bit in the book. A motif that happens that you can see in a lot of adolescent fiction. It's what I call the magic portal. Now, if you've read Peter Pan, the magic portal is the window in the apartment of Lucy and her brothers. Those are the kind of the protagonists that go into Neverland. Well, they fly through their window and they enter this, they eventually reach Neverland, which is this kind of mythical pretend sphere, right? Same thing happens in Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. What's the magic portal? It's the wardrobe. They go through the magic portal and then they're in this imaginary realm. Same thing happens in Harry Potter, except in that one, it's like a particular gate at a train station. And in all of those stories, I could also mention The Wizard of Oz and many others. In all of those stories, there's a protagonist and they go into the imaginary play realm. They go into the land of pretend, they learn something there, and they come back. And what I think is being missed by people like Jacques Derrida and Judith Butler even more so, it's a one-way trip. Like, they don't come back. It's like, the way that Judith Butler does this is, she emphasizes the performative aspect of gender, which I can grant. Like, there's an element that I would like. I see what you're seeing, Judith, but she makes that everything and doesn't come back to the sort of objective time and space bound reality that we are, in fact, binary. We're male or we're female, and that would have utterly changed her understanding of gender and gender performance. Her idea of gender is not linked to sex in a consistent way, so that it just it ends up being something where, yeah, you can pretend anything.
This is so fascinating. There's obviously a role for pretend in our society.
Yeah,
That's why
yeah,
we love
yeah,
movies so much.
absolutely.
But if you were to get on an airplane and then over the intercom they say, "Yeah, I want to let you know this plane was designed by postmodern engineers, and the engines were constructed with my truth," like, would you stay on that plane?
No.
Eventually, reality has to have a say.
Yeah, 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 and it doesn't. It doesn't for or not consistently for a lot of these people that we're talking about. It's frightening.
Yeah, I mean, with the gender thing, like one of the big ones that comes up is sports, and everyone throughout all of history has known there's differences between men and women,
Right.
right? It's just like one of the most common sense things.
Before we knew what XY chromosomes
Yes.
were or gametes or any of that.
And it's like, well, what if we pretended there was no difference? And then if you say, well, actually there is, now you're busting my bubble of pretend, which is causing me stress.
Yeah,
So now you're an aggressor. Like the
yeah,
whole way this is set up is just so bizarre.
yeah, yeah. And it really, it just has parent-child dynamics written all over it. Part of the role of, I would argue mothers, but perhaps even more so fathers, I don't know, it's debatable, is to say, no, that's not real. That's just pretend. And you have certain limitations that you just have to acknowledge and work with. It's like life is not just pretend. Yeah, but that's not happening.
Wow. Yeah. I'm wondering in the field of psychology, how you see some of these principles play out. Because I feel like this field, therapy, psychiatry, psychology, have been all very corrupted by this ideology.
We're talking, when we say ideology, are we talking woke? Are we talking specifically deconstruction or just,
Woke generally, but if you want to highlight deconstruction, you can.
a lot of what passes as woke, and I guess I would say this too about deconstruction, is it does seem to me like a very adolescent psychology. It's simplistic in its thinking in the way young people can be. You can't really sense any of the subtlety of thought, the maturity of experience, in any of its ideas. It's simplistic. It's, if you're a member of a certain class or a certain type of person, then certain things are true about you. That's not the thinking of a well-developed, mature human being. It's just it's not. The idea that, oh, if I just educate people about, certain beliefs, they're gonna be okay. That's a very I hate to keep using that word adolescent in a pejorative way, but it's kind of a juvenile form of thinking. A full-grown adult knows better.
It feels to me like the Marxist project ideology generally is kind of an infantile type of thinking. Like, I want perfection. I want it right now. I don't want to have to go through anything to get perfection. I demand it. And I'm going to have a temper tantrum if you don't give it to me.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, this is why, Milan Kundera associated youth and the archetype of youth with the spirit of revolution and specifically communism. And he wrote extensively about that. It's really for better or worse, a sort of a youthful spirit that wants to establish its own utopia and thinks it knows how that's going to happen and hasn't
It's
learned from history.
Yeah. Well, I think the reason a lot of them haven't learned from history is because history's not studied, and history often
Yeah.
is they attempt to erase it. And I'm thinking of Chairman Mao in the Cultural Revolution, the desire to get rid of everything old. The
Yeah.
revolution must only be new. Everything
Yeah.
old must go.
Yeah.
And part of this, like this eternal youth drive, seems to be let's just forget all of our past and pretend like our
Yeah.
society's old.
Yeah, 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 you're seeing the same archetypal pattern that I was getting at in the book. I mean, that's described as the Senex, the old man, also Father Time, associated with history, tradition, all of that. That's exactly what the eternal youth is in conflict with. So from a Jungian point of view, you kind of want to get those two archetypal dynamics sort of speaking to one another. But yeah, that's a perfect example. You got to overthrow the olds.
Yeah. Wow.
Absolutely.
When you look at university campuses, it's a lot of young people dealing with like this Peter Pan syndrome. When you look at like the pro-Palestinian protests, or is Black Lives Matter, there's been like a lot of various different protests. How do you see it manifesting differently when it's kind of this Peter Pan syndrome, but it's also all very young people?
Uh, okay. So I guess you're asking me to differentiate how, if the eternal youth manifests in an older person, it's going to manifest in a way different than it might
Mm.
manifest in a younger person, maybe.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's interesting. Right now on campuses, college campuses where a lot of these protests are taking place, it's as if the authority figures have self-identified as anti-authoritarian and revolutionary. So it's a weird dynamic where a lot of the students might think that they're really pushing up against the man like people in the 60s did, but it's absolutely already a movement that's corrupted by authority. It's being pushed by the authorities. It's being pushed by the professors. I don't know if that addresses what you
Yeah,
were
yeah, that
getting
was
at.
good. How do we fix the field of psychology
Ooh.
or psychotherapy, either one?
Yeah, that's beyond my pay grade, and I do wanna emphasize that I wasn't trained as a clinician, so I have kind of a different experience than a lot of people. I guess one of the ways we do it is by forming sort of parallel organizations, and I'm thinking of organizations like the Open Therapy Institute, which I'm a member of. I'm thinking of Critical Therapy Antidote, which is another organization that's pushing back against really the incursion of political thinking into psychotherapy. That's how I like to think about it. That's what's happening. We have to keep going back to, I think, some of the original genius of psychotherapy. Go back to some of the primary texts. And if you're not a depth psychologist and don't want to read Freud and Jung, fine. Go read Carl Rogers. His client-centered approach is going to look very, very different from someone who's been trained to think that their job is to create political change in the counseling hour, as opposed to meet the client where they're at, mirror back what you hear, that they're feeling and thinking, connect with them, witness them, interpret what you're hearing. There's all these really simple functional ways of just talking to a person that are psychotherapeutic that we just need to kind of go back. So I'd say go back to the fundamentals. The more we can encourage people to just go back to the fundamentals, hopefully, the more, we can reclaim psychotherapy. I would think that that is a possibility, but who knows? Maybe
Are you optimistic for the future of psychology and psychotherapy?
I go back and forth. I think a little, probably more optimistic, but I don't know. Things pass.
I got one final question for you, and that is, when you look at society more broadly, what is one thing we're not talking about enough that we should be talking about more?
The value of fully experiencing negative emotion.
Hmm.
That's what I would say. Think of trigger warnings. Think of the idea that we're supposed to act in a way that doesn't offend anybody. Both of those ideas suggest a really dysfunctional attitude towards disagreeable feelings. And I think one of the hallmarks of psychological health is what's called affect tolerance. It's what you try to, help a client build up. It's what you do in exposure therapy. If someone feels extreme anxiety at the thought of a spider, you slowly, conscientiously, compassionately expose them to the stimulus that causes them anxiety. If you're dealing with someone who has a heck of a father complex or whatever the issue is, you try to allow them to experience a lot of the emotional core of that complex, that thing that they're wrestling with, rather than, to help them run away from it. And, with things like trigger warnings or the idea that we're not supposed to ever offend anyone, it flies in the face of that attitude, that the attitude that says, actually, the difficult emotion, you're supposed to feel that. You're supposed to sit with it. You're supposed to work with it. You're not supposed to blame the external world for causing that emotion in you. You're supposed to really address it. That's the antithesis of what I'm seeing in the culture at large. So I'd like for us to talk about the value and importance of authentically suffering our lives.
Mm.
Yeah.
That was, it should be expected that you're going to give a deep answer, given who you are. But I love it. Dr. Bret Alderman, I've really enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for coming. I'd love to do it again sometime.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and I'd love to come on again.